Hello everyone, my name is Brandon Rowe, and in today's video I am going to be talking about my experience of taking psilocybin magic mushrooms, and I'm also going to be talking about taking this substance, this psychedelic drug, while also having a psychological or psychiatric disorder, and that is specifically bipolar disorder type 1. There is not much information out there online about what actually happens when people with this disorder specifically take psychedelics, and even less information on what happens when people with bipolar disorder take magic mushrooms. So that's the first reason why I'm making this. I'm also making this to talk about the substance in general, the things that I personally think are positive, some drawbacks, and I'm just going to explain my personal feelings. None of what you're going to see in this video is advice or medical advice, or I'm really not telling you whether you should or should not take any substances, but I am just only telling you my own experience so that you have more information to go off of when you may come to the time where you want to decide if you want to take something like this or not. So anyway, I'm going to include right now on the screen the time at which I will start talking about my trip report, basically where I describe my last psychedelic trip, where I took 1.5 dried grams of psilocybin magic mushrooms. If you want to see just the trip report, go to that time. Other than that, I'm going to go ahead and get started talking about how bipolar disorder and psychedelics, how they relate, and what happens when someone with bipolar disorder takes psychedelics from my own personal experience. Now, like I said in a previous video where I talked a little bit about my experiences with mushrooms, I said that it took me about 6 years from the time when I first wanted to try psychedelics to when I actually tried magic mushrooms for the first time. I wanted to try these when I was 17. I didn't try them until I was almost 23. And the main reason was because at age 18, I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder type 1, which is a very serious psychological disorder, mental illness, and this illness has severe and very life-changing impacts on me and the way that I experience things and what happens in my life. So I didn't want to play around with a substance like that, even though I really wanted to have the experience. I really wanted to take psychedelics to see more into the possibilities of experience, to the possibilities of consciousness. I didn't end up doing it for many years because I wanted to be careful, and I had heard many bad things about taking these substances, like any psychedelic, while having a mental disorder. Now, on many medical websites, it is commonly said that people with psychological disorders or psychiatric disorders, however you want to describe them, specifically bipolar disorder and schizophrenia, anyone with these disorders should not try psychedelics. Now, today I'm not talking about schizophrenia at all. I don't have it, I don't know much about it, and I'm not going to give you any standpoint or any of my opinions on whether you should take anything when you have schizophrenia, as I believe, in my personal opinion, that is more serious than bipolar disorder, and I don't want to give anyone bad information on that. Anyway, so when it comes to bipolar disorder, almost any medical website says not to take this, and even now where they are doing studies to see if psychedelics have the potential to treat depression and anxiety and other psychological illnesses, they have not really begun doing studies to see what effects these drugs have on bipolar disorder and schizophrenia. And this is for good reason. These are very serious disorders and they shouldn't be played around with. And also, psychedelics are very powerful chemical compounds that should not be played around with. So I understand why these studies haven't been done on bipolar disorder and schizophrenia, simply because the medical world doesn't really want to take that risk yet. But anyway, there are many ongoing studies right now in the medical field to see if psychedelics, specifically magic mushrooms, LSD, and ketamine, have the potential for treating disorders or mental illness problems such as depression and anxiety. So, with that in mind, that informs my own opinion on what effect bipolar disorder and psychedelics, specifically magic mushrooms, have on each other. An interesting thing that I found out was that the woman who initially introduced magic mushrooms to the Western world, they were unknown to the Western world until this woman introduced them to us. She actually said that she greatly regretted the decision of ever showing this substance to the Western world, to our cultures in the West, because we were trying to use this substance to find God, and that the substance, which she called, I think, the children, she referred to the mushrooms as the children, I believe. Anyway, she said that this plant, this mushroom, was meant to cure the sick. She said that was the whole point of taking mushrooms. She said that was what they were used for in her culture, and that is the only real use for them, that you should use them for. And it's interesting that she says that Westerners are taking these things to find God, because it shows that she really does believe that you do see part of God, or the grander, information of reality. I don't know how you want to describe it. Maybe God is a word that doesn't, resonate with you very well, or maybe you think that you have different ideas about God. Either way, that is something that she believed, and that is something that many people who have tried psychedelics believe, that there is some type of spiritual connection in the experience. But she specifically did say that that magic mushrooms, they were used to cure the sick in her culture for many generations. And that's very interesting to me, because now we are seeing in modern Western medicine, people are starting to see if it is possible to treat psychological disorders with these psychedelic drugs. And if you really think about it, what sickness would a psychedelic cure? Is it going to cure your cold? Is it going to cure the flu? Is it going to cure cancer? All these things are probably a no. If we can think about what effect psychedelics could likely have as far as a cure, it would probably be a psychological disorder, some type of mental problem, psychological problem, chemical imbalance. It would help something like that, if it has the potential to help anything. And that really comes to my personal opinion. I believe that through my own experiences, that used in the right way, these psychedelic drugs do have the possibility to have some effect in the future, to where they could help people. I think that it is good that Western cultures are finally seeing the possibility of this. And I don't want to say it's a cure, but more so I want to say that I do think, from my own experience, that for some people it may be at least somewhat safe to take psychedelics if you do enough research, if you are very careful. I first took magic mushrooms on a very small dose. It had a very positive effect on me. It was a very positive experience. But it's possible that maybe led to some life decisions that I made, such as quitting my job and going to a different job. And, these substances, like I said before, are not things that you should just play around with. They do have serious effects, and they are very powerful. My personal experience of taking magic mushrooms has been on my first trip on a small dose. I had a very positive, euphoric experience. During the second trip that I took, also on a relatively small dose, I had again a pretty positive experience, but I think it was only positive because I knew what to expect as much as you possibly could when taking a substance like this. I did hours and hours and hours of research over the years, hearing about what effects these things have, hearing about the benefits and the drawbacks. And I took it the second time while I was slightly depressed, or actually maybe not even slightly. I was in a bit of a depressive episode with my bipolar disorder. And it was in this episode that when I took the mushrooms, I experienced the same depression, or actually it was stronger than probably before I took them that day. So I experienced the full depression, but in a weird way, I was okay with it. It was like I was okay to go through with the process. And I ultimately think that this is partially one way that this substance might be helpful for people, specifically with disorders. And now, of course, there needs to be much more research done before anyone should ever try this or think that it's going to have a positive effect on them. I do this because I'm interested in expanding my consciousness and understanding more and having deeper experiences in life. But I just think that it's very interesting. From that experience, it allowed me to let go, to really go into what I was experiencing in my life. And now, on the third psychedelic trip, the third time that I took mushrooms, I took a higher dose. This isn't a huge dose. I took 1.5 grams. Many people out there take 5 dried grams. They call it a heroic dose. They talk about having much more profound and, hallucinatory, they just have very profound hallucinations and deeper experiences when taking a high dose, such as 5 grams. I took 1.5, and this is the trip that I'm going to be talking about for the rest of this video. So, when I took 1.5 dried grams, for the first probably 20 minutes or so, I didn't really feel anything. And I was waiting to see what effect it would have on me. Because the last trip that I had taken, which was on about half a gram probably, I didn't really have that strong of effects. Honestly, it was in a way almost weaker than the effects that marijuana has on your state of consciousness. So I was waiting to see if this would really do anything. And then I began having visual hallucinations. So there is wood paneling in my house. And the first thing that I noticed was that the patterns of the wood, like the wood grain, I saw that these patterns started to change. And I started to notice almost a significance in the patterns. It almost had like an Aztec or like Native American feel to it, is the only way I can describe it. It was like something about the patterns. That's the thought that I had when I saw them. It was almost like I was taken back to those cultures in those times. I don't know exactly why, but that's one thing that happened. The next thing that happened was there was a shadow cast on that same wall, and the shadow was a bit in the shape of a head. And now, through a lot of my childhood and even through some of my adult years, I had a very severe fear of aliens. And this head was in the shape of, a stereotypical alien, not really like a square head like a human. It was more, you know, triangular in a way, but the shadow was cast on the wall. This was when I wasn't really having that crazy of visual effects, but they were there. Now, I started looking at the head and I was just thinking, that's really interesting, that shape is cast on the wall right now, because I was pretty aware of what was going on. I knew that the trip was coming on, and I just knew that I had this strong fear of aliens. So I just stared at the shadow that was in the shape of a somewhat of an alien head for a while, and this was really one of the more extreme parts of the trip, simply because it was the first moment where I really knew that this was definitely altering my reality. The alien head, which, it didn't look like an alien. It didn't have any features. It was simply just a shadow, which, without even being on the mushrooms, would have been somewhat resembling the shape of an alien head. It turned slightly as if it were looking at me. And in that moment, I experienced this kind of like flash of fear. And this fear was like, it was intense, but I knew that this was just an experience happening on the mushrooms. I knew that I wasn't in any danger of aliens abducting me or anything. I knew that it was just a shadow on my wall. But also, even knowing all these things, it did visually, turn slightly and look at me. And it was very scary for that split second. And at the same second, I had an auditory kind of hallucination or heightening of my senses, to where it almost sounded like, it's kind of like when you have interference on a radio, or like you have like that static sound on a TV set. It was like that, but it was like at a super high volume, but there was nothing, no sound was coming, outside of me that made that sound. It was like internal, and it was like, I was so scared like that was happening. It freaked me out. But again, that was just for a split second. So then I began looking down at the carpet. I began seeing patterns. I began seeing colors that are regularly not noticeable in the carpet. And that was a really interesting part of the trip. And then right after that, my girlfriend woke up behind me. I was intending to do this trip alone while she was sleeping. And when she woke up, she was kind of upset because I had the lights on and it was a little bit late at night, and she had to wake up early in the morning. And she had wanted me to cook an omelet for her earlier in the week. So she was like, "Babe, please, can you go make me something to eat? I'm really hungry. You just woke me up because the lights are on. Just go do this for me." And I was like, okay, I'll go do this, knowing that I just took mushrooms, and that they were having strong effects on me. So I went into the kitchen and I tried to make the omelet, and I forgot to, whisk the eggs, mix them up before pouring them into the pan. So I had to try to do that in the pan. And then I completely butchered the omelet. I couldn't flip it over like normal, and it really turned into just eggs in the shape of an omelet that had been like really fucked up. And she was just like, "Yeah, I'm never gonna ask you to make eggs while you're tripping again, because those were some interesting eggs." And I think I forgot to put salt and pepper on them too. So it just shows that you aren't at normal, functioning capacity as far as completing simple tasks when you're on these substances. Now, the next thing that happened was I, sat back down and I was eating a steak that I had cooked just before I cooked that omelet. And I cooked that, earlier, like right at the start, like literally like minutes after taking the mushrooms, so I didn't really experience any hallucinations or anything while I was cooking the steak. So it was a steak. It was cooked all right. It was really good. Um, and then when I was eating the steak, I just was looking at the red, like, part of the steak, like the bloody part of the steak, and it was making me kind of sick. Now, like sick to the stomach feeling, like nauseous, but it was like this really intense nausea. I knew that I wasn't going to throw up, but it was almost like an emotionally powerful nausea, is the best way I could describe it. Now, I actually had to stop eating the steak in the middle of it, even though like it did taste really good. The just like seeing that it was like dead meat that was like red, and it just made me lose my appetite. So after that, my girlfriend went to bed, and I went to bed with her. And this is probably about 45 minutes into the trip, into when the trip really started, when I started having, noticing effects and having a different experience than normal. And I laid in bed. And this is when the peak of the experience happened. And this is the most profound experience I've ever had in my life. The most powerful experience I've ever had in my life. And this is what makes me very interested in trying magic mushrooms again and trying slightly bigger doses over time. This is what makes me very, very interested in the possibilities of this substance, because you hear people talk about going to different dimensions and different worlds and seeing kaleidoscopic visions of, colors and patterns, and it all sounds really crazy. And then you actually go through it, and it is life changing, just the magnitude and power of the experience. So when things really got serious, I mean, this is about an hour into my trip, an hour from once the effects started happening. And I was in the dark, and I had actually put the covers over my head so that everything was dark. And I began seeing these patterns and colors. It was almost like you would take, if you've ever been to a casino, or seen like the symbols at a casino, you'd see like those little, like neon sevens, and like the fruits that are like neon, and you'd see like, I was seeing like jesters' heads that are like neon and bright, but I was seeing like thousands of these things and like these strange patterns that took up my whole visual field. And they were like moving around, and it was just amazing. Really is all I can say. And then, this went on for probably like 30 minutes or so. And I took the covers away, so it wasn't complete darkness. There was still some light in the room, like not a ton, just like the kind of lights that you have on when, you're going to sleep. Like you have maybe like your clock has some light, or like, maybe a light in the corner. So the room was dimly lit, and also a little bit of light was coming in from outside from the windows, like the street lights were slightly coming in. But I was still seeing all of these things, even though I wasn't in the complete darkness anymore. And that was really interesting, and that was when I really started to appreciate the effects of it. And I started thinking back to many videos that I had listened to of Terence Mckenna, where you just hear his voice, and he's talking about taking these substances, and he's like, and this is really gonna knock your socks off kind of stuff. And he's relishing the experience and talking about the magnitude of it. And I was just like, wow, I'm finally here after all this time listening to all these videos, doing research on if this was healthy, or if I could do this, or if this would make me manic or depressed. After all that, I finally made it to that crazy next level world where all things turn inside out, and everything is beyond what you could even imagine. And then the craziest thing happened. Um, this is where it got the most intense part of the trip. Now, I have meditated before. I've practiced heartfulness meditation, mindfulness meditation, and I've done this before to try to deepen, my experience and try to, have a higher level of consciousness. So I do have a little bit of experience, with, losing your ego and becoming more in the present moment. But what happened to me at the peak of this trip was I had a complete ego death. Now, maybe there are steps beyond this. Maybe there are ego deaths grander than this. I'm sure it's possible. But I no longer knew that I was Brandon Rowe. I no longer knew that I was human. I no longer knew. I was completely out of this realm of experience on planet Earth. Um, and it was like I wasn't even seeing things through my eyes necessarily. I had just become the experience of these otherworldly things. I was actually, I had my head on the pillow, and then there was another pillow directly in front of me that my girlfriend was sleeping on. But the pillow was very close to my head, so maybe a few inches away. And I was just looking at this pillow, and that's like I just completely lost myself. My ego was completely gone. My idea of myself, my idea that I was human, all of this completely disappeared. And that was one of the most amazing and most blissful experiences. It was the most amazing, most blissful experience I've ever had. This brings to mind where people talk about connecting to Source, connecting to God, or, higher consciousness, or, this is the part of trips where it now makes full sense to me when people talk about how psychedelics have a real and significant spiritual effect and a connection to spiritual things and a connection to a deeper truth of reality. And this was just mind blowing beyond anything that I had ever imagined before. But I was totally prepared for this in the way that I had listened to hours and hours and hours of Alan Watts and Terence McKenna and Leo Gura on actualize.org and Jed McKenna and Frank Yang, all these people talking about ego death, talking about disillusion of self, of no self, of oneness, of non-duality, all of these spiritual kind of ideas. This was the first time I got a real big taste of this. And this was just incredible. I cannot even express in any way how profound this whole experience was. Now, I kind of lost time during this because honestly that this all started maybe like an hour and 15 minutes, like that maybe ego death part of it started anywhere from like an hour and a half to like 2 hours after first feeling the effects of the mushrooms. And I was in that state to varying levels of intensity for roughly, I really don't know. I would have to guess maybe like 3 hours because I after that started to die down, I noticed that the sun was coming up and I was back in my room. I knew that I was in my room um, during the less intense periods of this, and I would snap out of it every maybe 15 minutes or so if I had to guess. I would snap out of like this crazy experience I was having to look around the room, and I could still see things, but it was like I was at certain points it was like I was looking at the same room just with as a completely different being. Like I did not see it in the same clear as day like human way of experience. it was really something else. And eventually, these feelings started to die down. And I started to come back to, the normal state. And then actually, my girlfriend and I had a little bit of an argument. She wasn't too happy with me. Um, and it was, unrelated to the trip and everything. But at that point, I was more like aware of, everything like in a normal human way. And this is when the next stage of the trip started to happen. And the next stage of the trip was when I began to feel a very deep sense of terror. Now, when I say terror, I mean the epitome of fear. I mean, this is, if you have not taken psychedelics and you haven't almost died, you've probably never experienced this level of terror in your life. Probably nowhere, anywhere near to this. This was like 100 times stronger sense of fear than I had ever had in my life. It was like a gut wrenching terror. Well, my girlfriend was like upset with me, and it was just. But the interesting part of it was I knew that it was all part of this experience. I knew that this was all just a heightened consciousness state of mind. So I wasn't resisting the terror. I wasn't resisting the fear in the same way that, someone who doesn't know much about psychedelics or is just tripping to have fun with their friends or thinks it's cool or takes it at a party or something. That's when I could see that people would have a bad trip. But since I kind of understood it was all just part of the process and to let go and let it happen, I made it through it just fine. And maybe like 30 minutes to an hour after that, the trip started to die down more. The sun started coming up, and I was basically back to normal a bit, but it was also in a really changed way. Like, I still could feel that my brain had been changed. And an interesting thing happened up until maybe like 10 hours after the trip. I felt like physical movement in my brain. It was almost like my brain was literally changing. And it might be possible that it actually was. Again, I'm not a full expert on psychedelics or their effects, but I have heard that they do have the potential for having long-term effects on your brain and your chemistry, your neurochemistry. So that is something that really interests me to know if maybe that was in some way changing my brain. But anyway, we got to pretty much the end of the experience. I think I've talked about it enough here, and I am excited and happy to try this again and also report back to you guys. But I would say, after going through this on a bit of a higher dose, that I am much less afraid than I was before about taking psychedelics. I do still treat them with respect. I am still going to give a good amount of time for, myself to come back into a normal experience of life where I'm not, really experiencing anything in that kind of psychedelic way anymore. I'm going to let things cool down before my next trip. This is something that I'm going to be continuing. I'm going to try this again after giving myself some time to adjust back to, normal life and integrate this experience that I had on the mushrooms. So if you're interested in seeing more videos about this, about my trips, about my thoughts on how it affects our psychology, and if you want to learn more about my opinions on these things, feel free to subscribe. I will be making more videos about this content. I am very excited to do more trips and report back with exactly what happened. So other than that, I hope that you all have enjoyed the video, and give it a like if you did, and hopefully I'll see you again in another video. Thanks. Thanks.